Hey, this is Chuck Rowe from Midwest Studies Group. Thanks for joining us yet for another edition to our video series. This week's topic, mental health for nonprofit leadership. Joining us today from MindView, Dr. Brian Davidson. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Chuck.
What is MindView, the mission and how you got started, and a little bit of the history?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the origins of all this. I tell people it started with curiosity. So I did all my graduate work at the University of Kansas. Before then, I was a high school teacher. I was so curious on why my students were succeeding and thriving, and I thought it came down to intrinsic motivation, self-discipline in those kids. And so I thought, okay, I want to figure out how that stuff develops in people. So I came down to KU, began to study all these factors, and then started to wonder if it was possible to teach and cultivate a lot of these skills that I was learning about, things like grit, resilience, and hope, and growth mindset and motivation. So that kind of became my goal. And after I finished up all my graduate work, I launched the company, and we developed up an assessment to measure all these factors, and then I now take steps to build these through professional development and leadership development training. So that would be us.
Well, obviously, a lot of the things that you're talking about, those different traits, are things that you want to see in leadership.
Yeah.
And when you think about nonprofit leadership, why do you think so many leaders these days are dealing with high stress and mental health issues now compared to maybe 5 years ago before the pandemic?
Yeah, good question. I think it's hard, right? Leadership is very hard, and there's so many unknowns that come along with the process. It's unpredictable, and it's always changing. Is the reality of it. In my dissertation, Chuck, we looked at these mindset factors in relationship to transformational leadership behavior, which is a proxy for who's demonstrating these successful leadership skills. And we looked at a whole bunch of variables, including things like the leader's cognitive ability, their family background, their years of leadership experience. And guess what? We found that none of those things predicted whether or not they were demonstrating these transformational leadership skills. But we found that the best predictor of whether or not they were demonstrating these successful skills was their sense of hope, which is more so about when a leader is pursuing their goals and they hit some roadblock or obstacle, do they feel like they can find a pathway or avenue around that roadblock and obstacle? And so what we found is like great leaders are very hopeful leaders who cultivate a strong sense of hope. Well, the reality is, as you're facing a lot of unknowns and unpredictability, sometimes that hope can start to wane and decrease in us. And so it's important to often get a gauge of this and then take some steps to build up that sense of hope. Now, with my dissertation, we found second best predictor of the successful leadership behavior was that leader's sense of grit. So grit's all about this passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And we found that these great leaders, they tend to have a strong sense of passion for what they're doing. They're like immersed in their work, but they also have a sense that, hey, I could stick with this for a long period of time. And grit's something people often ask me, like, how do you develop grit? And it's not something that you can just like force upon somebody, but instead you have to like pull it from within somebody, help them understand like what really ignites their interest, what makes them get really excited, what puts them into that flow state where they are so meshed into their work, and then to figure out what do they feel like they want to pursue over the long term, not just for days or weeks, but rather months to years, decades of time.
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned this because in the nonprofit world, it was such a reliable position before the pandemic because you knew where your revenue was coming from the most part. You knew who your donors were. You knew what your plan and your long-term plan was going to be. You knew who your staff were going to be. You knew where your clients were going to come from. After the pandemic, it just not just for nonprofits, but for everyone. Now it's like, okay, where is our money coming from? Does our programs need to change? And we don't even have enough staff now to cover everything. So, to talk over these types of issues, simply put, why is it so important for people to get mental health coaching, and why is it such a great benefit?
Well, I think number one, I think we need to differentiate between mental health and mental wellness. Okay. The mental health side, incredibly important, but in psychology, that's focused largely on what's wrong with people, the anxiety, the depression, the post-traumatic stress, so forth. And I think, while it's been done for many positive purposes, that sometimes we can get overly fixated on all the bad stuff that's going on. And I like to take the approach more so focusing on the positive qualities. I think we could do a lot more good by emphasizing more of the positive psychological factors, the hope, the grit, the resilience, and building up those positive mental muscles, as opposed to constantly focusing on what's wrong with somebody as an individual. So to me, the more that we can emphasize that is going to be very important. But I think as we start to talk about this more, right, and have these sorts of conversations and recognize the impact that what our minds do, and how that drives our behavior and how we perform and how much we excel. I mean, it's incredible, Chuck, that we find that these things are so predictive of numerous positive life outcomes, anywhere from like our kids in school, how well they're doing and their likelihood of graduating from school, to workplace outcomes, leadership success, to even things like labor market outcomes. These behavioral economists have gotten their hands on all this research and started to study these factors and find that these mindset components are predictive of who's making more money across a lifespan. I know, and then importantly, the mental and physical health side as well. That we know that many of these factors help protect us against some of those psychopathologies like depression, anxiety that we can experience, but also the physical health too. That some studies are supporting that these elements are actually predictive of like healthcare expenditures in late adulthood, and even things like life expectancy of people. So the more that we can start to get a gauge of this and get some awareness and start to have conversations, I think it's going to help a lot of people, leaders to students to everybody in between.
Well, I love that you talked about mental wellness and how that's a positive thing to do.
Mhm.
Obviously, spending time with you and your team with coaching with individuals. Are you starting to notice that maybe the stigma of talking to a coach about mental wellness is starting to maybe go away a little bit?
Somewhat, not as much as I think we thought would happen. Like post pandemic, there was a lot of conversations going on post pandemic about or during the pandemic about mental health, and now we're almost seeing that there's kind of a move back towards focusing on performance. Right, we need our people to perform, but the reality is, kind of mental wellness and performance, they go hand in hand. Right, we can probably relate just as leaders, right, when we're not doing the best, right, where we find ourselves in a high state of stress, or we find ourselves struggling, we're not going to be able to perform at our elite best. And so it's important that we do kind of have that grasp. But yeah, now I'd say it hasn't come around quite to what we maybe anticipated, but we're getting steps forward, and it's been beneficial.
And it's important to remember that everybody's different. So because of that, there's no cookie cutter approach necessarily. So coaching does have to be individualized. And how do you go about describing that with your organization?
Yeah, so with our side, we do a range of professional leadership development webinars, and also provide individual coaching as well. And we find that that human component, Chuck, is just so important. Before we hopped on this call together, I was talking with a leader from a different organization, and we were talking about like how do you develop these skills. And I keep coming back, Chuck, that the best way to cultivate these skills are through people, is through conversations, is through relationships that these factors get cultivated. We can all think back to people in our own lives, in our own leadership journeys, that have helped mentor us and guide us and kind of coached us through those difficult times, hard times, and also pushed us, when we need a little bit of pushing. So to me, it's those relationships are the primary drivers of a lot of these skills like motivation, grit, resilience.
And with those relationships, or maybe some other tips that come to mind, what are some things that people could do maybe day to day? Maybe they don't have the opportunity to talk to a coach. Maybe they don't have the opportunity to just leave work and just blow off steam for a little bit. What are
Mhm.
some things they could do on a day to day basis to maybe take care of their mental wellness?
Yeah, I just think back to some of these things that I was teaching these surgeons about yesterday. Number one, I think, is the importance of how we look at stress. And so I shared with these surgeons yesterday a study that found they basically asked people to rate your level of stress, and then to also rate how harmful you think that stress is to your health. And what they found is that the people who said that they were highly stressed and that stress is very harmful to their health, those people had incredibly higher rates of premature death relative to others in this study. what they found was incredibly interesting is the people who said that they had high stress, but that stress is not detrimental to their health, they had the lowest risk of dying of any group in the study, including those who said that they had little to no stress at all in their life. And so what I told this group is, it's not always the stress that kills us. It's more so our mindset towards that stress. And if we think that stress is going to ruin us, okay, chances are it might, right? But if we can flip our mindset towards that stress and realize, yep, this is very stressful, but this is a normal part of life. Okay, this is a normal part of the human experience. This is a normal part of being a leader that and I can get through this. This is just the next challenge that I have to face. That's going to lead to much better outcomes for a person throughout their life. Now, another thing too, when it comes to like resilience, is so often when we as leaders, okay, face some hardships, we like to withdraw and isolate, and that's one of the worst possible things that we can do. Okay, instead, you want to make sure that you lean in to people, right? You've got a group of people or an individual that you can go to and just bat some ideas around, and talk through some ideas and concepts. But you don't want to withdraw. You don't want to isolate because that leads to rumination, where we just get the wheels turning, and then that leads to more harmful outcomes over time. Now, another thing too is we don't ever, when we face that stress and adversity as leaders, we don't want to just have a sense of learned helplessness where we feel like, oh, there's just nothing I can do about these circumstances that I'm facing. I pull a lot from the work of Viktor Frankl, who wrote a very well-known book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in this book, he talks about, so Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he talks about in this book how they experienced the atrocities of the Holocaust. They were in Auschwitz. Lost most of his family there in Auschwitz, and he talked about how these prisoners in Auschwitz would look around at what the Nazis were doing to them, and they would tell themselves, "Well, there's nothing that we can do about these circumstances. This is so beyond our control." And Frankl said the one thing, okay, that kept him going was the fact that he told himself, like, yes, we can't control this, but there's only one and only one thing that we can't control, and that's how we think about, process, and respond to this situation that we face. And that's the one thing that is within our control. And so as leaders, that's what we want to have, is the sense of, hey, we can't control everything out there, but we can always control our response to those circumstances that we face. And if we don't, right, if we don't take that approach, then we can develop what's called this learned helplessness, where we just kind of put up our hands and say, well, geez, there's nothing I can do, and then that person just kind of gives up. They give up hope. And then the last thing that I maybe mentioned, Chuck, is to just recognize stress is a normal part of the journey. Like there's going to be ups and downs. I think so often, especially for those of us that get, highly involved with social media and see people posting all this great stuff that they're doing, and what their families are doing, and the awards and accolades that they're getting, we can internalize that ourselves and think, oh man, like my life kind of stinks. I'm not doing this, or I'm not achieving that. And so that can lead to a lot of detrimental outcomes for us. But instead, recognize, number one, that a lot of stuff on social media is not reality, in many cases. But I think it's important for us, especially for younger populations too. We see this, especially with younger groups, is that they think they should be happy 100% of the time. And if they're not, there's something wrong with them. And I think we need to flip that script a little bit to recognize that it's perfectly normal to not be happy all the time in your life. That you're going to have ups and downs, and that's just normal part of the journey. And so to recognize stress is going to be there, but to flip that idea of how we think about that stress will help people, as I mentioned previously.
Well, it sounds like a lot of things that you're mentioning right now are really just trying to keep things in perspective, and that maybe not trying to compare, and maybe just kind of focusing on yourself, keeping things in perspective. Um, are there some tips and tricks that you tell people on how to remind yourself about keeping things in perspective?
Yeah, so an activity that we do a lot, different organizations, is we spend some time, and we call this my list of what's gone wrong. And so we say, okay, we pull out phones, or sometimes we'll use a piece of paper, We'll say, let's title this my list of what's gone wrong. And then the person goes through and they think about the past 3, 4, 5 years and they write out everything that has gone wrong in their life. And it just gets them to think about all the adversity that they've encountered. And then after they've had a few minutes to do that, I say, okay, now I want you to take that title, my list of what's gone wrong, and I want you to cross that out. So cross that out, delete that that's on your phone. And I want you to write in the following. I want you to write in my list of what I have overcome. And so now they see everything that they've experienced from a very different mindset, from a very different approach, that these, in fact, are things that I have faced. This is adversity that I have faced, but these are things that I've overcome and gotten through. And that this helps the individual to recognize, yes, I have dealt with a lot, but I am a resilient person. I have gotten through that, and I'm also ready to tackle the next challenge that I have to face in the future. So it's a pretty powerful activity when we do that. I would just encourage anybody that's listening to this, any leader out there, do this. You can do this with your team, spend some time to do that. It's a really, really powerful activity.
Well, obviously, you bring a lot to the table, not only with your knowledge, but your facilitation and your coaching and being able to interact with the clients that you serve. If an organization wanted to learn more about your services, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, I'd say just go check out our website, mindvue.com, mindvue.com. I am on LinkedIn myself. I'm not highly involved with a lot of social media, but I am on LinkedIn. They can find me on LinkedIn. And you can feel free to post my email address, Chuck, if people want to reach out to me directly by email. Welcome that as well. But I appreciate the opportunity to be on here.
Well, I know you're a busy man, so thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck.
And to everyone else, thanks again for watching Chuck Rowe Midwest Studies Group. Catch you next time.